Hey, all, and welcome to Jen's Thoughtful Tuesday turnaround. I am so thankful to be here. This is my first official podcast of the Thoughtful Tuesday turnaround, which is why I probably stumbled over the title of it. So I'm really excited to be kicking this off as both a live cast each week and then also going to be downloading it as a podcast here in the next week. So anyway, what I am going to be doing each week on Thoughtful to, Thoughtful Tuesday turnaround is all about really breaking down some of the things that get us stuck. As you know, as I know, as anyone I know knows, Tuesdays can be a real bitch. And regardless of what your work week is, everyone has a Tuesday. It's like the second day of the week. It's already things are starting to build up and you are just up to here, right? And today was no different. I got hit with a ton of things I did not expect at the beginning of the day. It was one of those days in HR, and y'all know what I'm talking about, where I'm just grateful I got a couple of things checked off my list. So Tuesdays can really throw us off our game. I've noticed. And what I really want to be able to do is take not only Tuesdays being a time where so many of us struggle, it's also a time where I would love and I'm going to love to further digest the Thrive and Shine HR podcast. So if you're not familiar, Catherine Fry and I host a weekly podcast called Thrive and Shine HR. And on it, we talk about things that really matter for people in the HR profession. And it's really around how we're taking care of ourselves and how we're showing up for ourselves and for others. So in this podcast, every episode is about something that really matters around how we want to be showing up and maybe how we're not showing up the way that we most want to. So what this podcast here is going to do is going to follow it up where you don't need to be HR, you just really need to be a human being who cares about how we show up, because each week's subject is something that's relevant for everybody. So yesterday, Catherine and I, our subject was around change. How do we react to change? How do we show up around change? And is it something where we need to kind of gut check ourselves? And, with Catherine and I, we tend to be really honest about the areas where we know that we struggled for a long, long time. And one of them was around awareness. And for Catherine and I in particular, we really notice now that we do coaching for others, how much so many of us get stuck around not really being fully aware of how much a problem or how much something is impacting us and what it would take for us to rise up and make the changes that are needed in order to shift the dynamic. And I think that awareness is a really, really big area for us in HR that I think within that podcast and now with this podcast and live cast, it's going to be all about breaking it down and saying, okay, let's go a little bit deeper here and let's really talk about what this means and how we can start applying this stuff in our life. So with the episode yesterday, one of the things that we talked about and Catherine had brought up is something that we call emotional contagion. And it's around, let's say that within your organization, there is some proposals that the leadership, the owners, whoever is proposing, and they want you to sell it to the employees, right? But you don't really understand all the details of it. It seems pretty confusing. It doesn't necessarily seem to be in alignment with what you've seen in the organization in the past. There's a lot of loose ends in your mind, but yet you have leaders or owners or whatever coming to you and saying, okay, sell it, right? Emotional contagion is where we end up kind of in a position where we're trying to kind of navigate how we really feel about something compared to how we're being told we should feel about something. And then how we then kind of present ourselves and whether that presentation of ourselves ends up bleeding onto others. So in that example, like I've seen so many times before, especially being in HR for as long as I have, where situations like that happen, right? Leadership or owners will come to management or their leadership team and say, hey, here are the changes we want to make. We want you guys to be excited about it. Go out and sell it, right? And now you have these leaders like, I don't understand what's happening right now. So they then go out and with that confusion, with that frustration, with that lack of understanding, that then bleeds out. So, being aware of those types of things when it comes to change and then how we then kind of present ourselves through that process can really be like a mind blow, I think, for so many of us when we start to really gut check around where we show up. So it's pretty wild. And then the last thing that, we talked about yesterday that was so impactful for me is, when it comes to the changes that we know that we need to make in our lives to be the best that we can be, it will require us to be ready, willing, and able to be a black sheep, to stand out, to be a little different, to be called out, to be ridiculed, whatever it is. I have been there so many times. I think the more and more I stand firm in my values and my integrity, the more sometimes people really push hard back on that. And so the reality of change is that we have to be willing to be that black sheep. We have to be willing to kind of stand out there alone. The cheese stands alone, as my boss Nick would say. You have to be willing to do that and die on that mountain. So anyway, what I wanted to do today on this first Thoughtful Tuesday turnaround, I got it right this time, woohoo, is I want to talk about the 5 stages of change and how for all of us, I think when we are more aware around the stage that we might be in, the stage that others that we love might be in, depending on the change in our lives that we're hoping can happen, the more that we understand those stages, the more I think it's truly going to revolutionize the way that we can show up for ourselves and others, because we will then be much more aware that it's a process, and that process is not linear. So real quick, the 5 stages of change, I've heard many different places over the years, but over the last week, I've been listening to a podcast by a gal named Beth Hillman, and she does a parenting podcast called Parenting Post Wilderness. So Parenting Post Wilderness is all about her now adult kids who all boys, I think 4 or 5 boys, and the struggles that she had with each of them, and the youngest of them, so much so that he during high school got into drugs, he got into really bad behaviors. And so she ended up getting into coaching to help other parents who really struggle. And I definitely relate to struggling parent right now in this chapter in my life. So anyway, on this podcast, one of the things she talks about is in order to truly be able to impact someone and kind of, yeah, I don't even want to say move towards change, but the way that we truly, I think, best help and support others is when we are also taking care of and supporting ourselves. And so when you think about the change, 5 stages of change, it's really about understanding not only where someone else might be, but also where we might be as well. So first stage in the 5 stages of change is what they call the pre-contemplation stage. And it otherwise could be known as the unawareness stage. And unawareness is really just that they don't see it. They don't get it. They don't see it. And so we in HR, we see this all the time, right? This is where we really struggle with things like PIPs and development plans and final warnings and all of these things because we want so hard. We want so hard to believe in these people. We want so badly for them to be able to see, oh my gosh, the way I'm communicating, the feedback, I'm going to listen to it, I'm going to apply it. But over and over and over again, when you're in HR, one of the things that they say that turns us dark is really around this piece, around the people that we're trying to work with and trying to help support who are in pre-contemplation when it comes to changing a behavior, right? If you really sit them down with them, and have a very strong conversation with them, maybe by the end of it, because they're clearly in the corner, they're going to acknowledge and recognize it. But these people who are in the pre-contemplation stage are going to go right back into it again. Whereas then the next time that something like this happens, they're the very first to call out, what are you talking about? Like, I didn't do, they just immediately are not able to see the behavior. And so, one of the things I want to offer to anyone who's going to be listening or watching this particular podcast is when we think about the areas where we're struggling with those around us. And I'm not just talking about when you're in an HR role and struggling with the managers or the other employees around you. I'm also talking about in our personal lives, our relationships, our partners, our kids, our parents. In those relationships in our lives, it's important that we kind of recognize in those dynamics, where is it that I can recognize that there are things about this other individual that I wish that they could change. I wish that they would want to change. I wish that I could change for them, right? Like, what are those things? And being really honest with yourself. And then two, what are the things that come up repeatedly from the people who are closest to you in your life, whether it's work relationships or whether it's home relationships, around change, around something that they wish that you would do differently, that you would do better, that you would do more? What are those things that you have noticed for you? Because as we go through this, as we talk about pre-contemplation and we talk about the other steps in the change model, I think knowing those can really, start to help unlock sometimes where in our relationship dynamics themselves, there might be an opportunity to really lean in to some of the things that might be under the surface to that may be contributing to the disconnect, creating that, that dynamic of, somebody wanting you to change or you wanting somebody to change and them not seeing it or not wanting to, not recognizing that it's something that is needed or that is, and I take that back, not necessarily needed. I think it's an opportunity for curiosity around why there is a divide between the two. So anyway, so once you get to, your pre-contemplation, the way that Beth Hillman talked about it on our podcast was that you're not ready, right? So sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. Sometimes, like during our PIP conversations or other types of meetings, you see it towards the end and then it goes away and then it comes back and then it goes away, right? Those are how I know we see those in our personal and work relationships, right? Where they see it and then they don't see it. And so that is the process of pre-contemplation. And so once you get past that stage, you start to get into contemplation, or otherwise known as awareness. You now recognize pretty consistently that this is something that needs to change. And whether, again, that's, as you're kind of thinking about where this could show up in your life, you kind of think about where, are areas that you are wishing other people could change at work or at home, and also areas where you've noticed other people are wishing that you could change. And is awareness possibly that place where you may be, or they may be, that they see it, but yet they're still not quite fully to the point where they are ready to actually engage to changing that behavior. The next phase, which is really a phase that so many of us get into, is what we call the preparation stage, or as Beth calls the wanna, the wanna stage. And the wanna stage is a phase of change where you really want to change. This was me and drinking for years, right? I really wanted that to change. I knew deep down that it was something that did not work for me. As much as I could see other people going out drinking socially and wanting to be that person so bad, like I want to be able to be that person, it just was not meant to be for me. And so once I got to the one-on-one stage, that was the tough part. It's like, I want that. I want to get to that point. And yet there was such a pull at that time. And I think that when it comes to really any change, that is so, so common. And we see ourselves sometimes coming in and out of this, sometimes where we really want to be able to make the change that is going to be so needed in our lives. And yet we really are not fully ready to make that leap, and it's going to require that extra oomph in some way to get to the point where it really is going to start to make a bigger difference. All right, the last couple stages of the change is action. So once you get past your pre-contemplation, your unawareness, you get into awareness, then you get into your one-on-ones or your preparation. Now you're taking action. And this is where so many people kind of bounce in and out of. They talk about like yo-yo diets and all the different things. If you think about you're in and you're out, these are New Year's resolutions, right? I'm going all in, and then the next thing you know, you're back out again. The way I see this a lot show up for people are the ones who have really big goals and dreams, and they want to kind of do these amazing things, but yet when they get to their weekend, all they want to do is be lazy and do nothing. And, I get it. I totally, totally get it. But in that case, when you're in that kind of action, non-action, action, non-action, that's a really good time to really gut check with your values around what is really, truly important to me and whether or not I'm really going to put in the effort to make this a more of a commitment versus kind of coming in and out of that stage of change. But again, when we talk about change not being linear, that is like so, so, so true. And, change not being linear means that coming in and out of these different phases of change as you're trying to figure yourself out, or other people are trying to figure themselves out, is so important to understand. It helps me, I think, as I've learned this both through Beth on her podcast and also through other ways in my life. It's given me so much more patience and it's given me so much more compassion for other people and what they might be going through and how hard it can be to make important changes in our lives. Number five, the fifth stage of change is maintenance. And that's where you get past really the hard push of the action. It's usually 6 months in or so. I don't know where that number came from, but it's going to be a long enough time where then it's about maintaining. Then it's about continuing to show up for yourself, continuing to ensure that the whoever else is showing up for themselves, and maintaining and continuing to recognize that it matters. So finally, the last stage of change, which nobody wants to have to deal with, but everybody knows what I'm talking about, is relapse. Relapse is where we fall, and we need to recognize that that is a part of the process, and where 98% of us give up. And when we know that, when we become really super clear about that and recognize that 98% of the fold are going to give up and they will not continue to get their asses back up after the fails or after they don't get exactly where they want to be, that is how we actually kind of start changing, the world. is by learning how to kind of push through the failures that come as we're trying to make changes. And I'm like, I recognize them as I'm like talking about this. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm making this very personal, which is interesting. I kind of started this out talking more about the broader sense of change in a bigger context. But really, I think, when I think about people who inspire me, like Jay Shetty, Mel Robbins, Simon Sinek, over and over and over again, what you hear and what I internalize is change always begins within. So when you work at an organization that has a lot of movement and a lot of change, and that's something that you are uncomfortable with or comfortable with, either way, I think it's really such a good opportunity for anybody to recognize that when there's a lot of chaos externally, and how that then shows up for ourselves internally, I think is such a good gut check, because change being something that we have to experience, throughout our lives, is happening constantly around us, and being able to kind of figure out how we are then maybe making it more personal than it needs to be. I know a lot of times, especially in work dynamics, you'll see people who are feeling and sensing that change from leadership and somehow means that they have been doing it wrong, and it's judgment against them. I've seen that not too long ago, where there was a change in leadership, or a leadership made a change around procedural things that management had been doing for quite some time, and the head leadership is somewhat new to the organization. And when that happened, several leaders came to me and said, it really felt as though that leader must think that we're doing it wrong, and that we don't know what we're doing. And it's so fascinating to me that sometimes the reasons why that change may have been initiated, you don't know, right? But then our brains and our minds immediately start going into this spin around what we think that it might be, right? And when that happens, then the next thing you know, now we're starting in this narrative around thinking that it's got something to do with the fact that that leader thinks that I was doing it wrong, or that I'm bad in some way, and I have to be fixed and changed. And so it's just fascinating. And so that's another reason, I think, to pay attention to when change is presented to you, or when you are you and a friend, let's say, go out to lunch this weekend, and you're talking about their work and how things are going. And they start talking about, oh, the leaders came and they're having us do this, and blah, blah, blah. Listen and pay attention to the energy that they put around that, and how they might be internalizing it. Because I think for me, the way that I can show up for my loved ones and understanding those stages of change when they're struggling with their own stuff is really, really a powerful tool. And so I don't need to be a therapist. I am a coach, but I don't even need to be a therapist to be able to start kind of learning these things, and then be able to kind of make a shift in how I might be able to help support others through whatever change stuff that they're going through. So it's neat, as Catherine and I were preparing for the episode on Monday, that ended up happening with me just the weekend before, where somebody was talking about something that they were going through, and I was able to kind of help reframe them and recognize where they were in that in that phase of change. And they were in a pre-contemplation. They were not really aware that they were pushing up back against the change, that they were fighting against it, rather than having kind of an open mind before they immediately assumed that it was not going to work. And I don't know. I know I've been guilty of that in the past. So I think, for her, it was really fun in a way as we were able to kind of dissect it and pull it out and that sort of thing. And that's one of the things I think with this live series and podcast is really about taking what Catherine and I are building through the Thrive and Shine podcast and really taking it to that next level and saying, well, wait a second, let's talk a little bit about how we kind of see change through the eyes of ourselves and also how we can see it differently when we see others around us and how they might be internalizing change. So it's really quite a great, I think, tool that can help all of us. And so it's something that I thought would be fun to share on this first episode. So, with that, I am going to wrap up these episodes. I'm going to try to keep under 30 minutes as much as possible. And my goal is to grow this podcast and hopefully be able to continue to spread the word and help people grow their minds so we can show up even better for ourselves and others. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.